George Russell wins the Australian Grand Prix, and the Silver Arrows are back on top to start this new era of F1. They look like they were in control for almost the entire weekend, but do they still need to be worried about Ferrari? And is there a chance Ferrari gave away a win on Sunday? And it was heartbreak for Oscar Piastri and the Australian fans as the hometown hero crashed out before the race even started. But why does his team have some work to do after leading the field for the past 2 years? And of course, some midfield talk. A good weekend for Audi, Racing Bulls, and Haas, and a not so good weekend for Williams, Alpine, Cadillac, and Aston Martin. Who look like the best of the rest, and who is going to need to show some patience this season? We've got a lot to discuss coming out of the Australian Grand Prix, and it's all coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. We came into this weekend with a lot of anticipation over these new regulations and exactly what they would look like on track. And we had some good moments, and we definitely had some ugly moments, but at the same time, it wasn't a boring race. And I think F1 is probably a little bit relieved that this weekend wasn't a complete disaster. I'm going to get to Mercedes in a second, who really stole the show this weekend, but I feel like we should start with what happened before the race even started, with Oscar Piastri not even making it to lights out, crashing on the reconnaissance lap before the race even started. Just absolutely brutal. And it was probably a little confusing for a lot of people who didn't watch any of the pre-race stuff and then turned the race on and were sitting there wondering, where's Oscar? But for those of you who didn't see it, Oscar's warming up his tires on the way to the grid, just completely loses the car, sends it into the barriers, ending his day before it even started. Looking at the replay, probably a little bit of driver error, a little bit on the complexity of the new cars. Of course, Oscar admitted to it after the fact too. He clips the curb, loses the back end of the car. Said afterwards that he was going through his shifts, got an unexpected power spike while shifting gears. But at the same time, probably not the best place on track to be going through gear shifts, especially when you're on the curbs and especially in these new cars that are so sensitive. So definitely something for not only Oscar, but for a lot of these drivers to learn from and try to avoid happening again. But that Australian podium curse continues. Still no Australian driver to make it onto the podium for the Australian Grand Prix since it became an F1 race on the calendar. And also not a great record at this track for Oscar either. He did have a P4 in 2024, but only P8 and P9 in his other two races here. But again, for this go-around, just such a disappointing result for Oscar because he looked like he was really starting to get a handle on the car. He seemed like he had the upper hand on Lando really the entire weekend, which was really impressive at points because it was clear this McLaren car was a step behind Mercedes, a step behind Ferrari, did not have the pace that we were used to. So for Oscar to be up there, had the fastest time in FP2, was in the mix with the top drivers throughout a lot of these sessions. Just really disappointing for him to not even make it to the race start. But even with that being said, I don't think he missed out on a race win or a podium. Probably would have gotten P5 looking at how everything shaked out. I think he would have, stayed ahead of Lando, finished ahead of Lando. But that's probably as high as he would have gotten with the two Mercedes and the two Ferrari drivers out ahead of him. But just, again, absolutely brutal for Oscar Piastri. Absolutely brutal for the Australian fans who came out to see their hometown hero racing just minutes from where he grew up. And it's something that's going to sting for Oscar for a very long time. And hopefully we don't see things unravel like they did at the end of last season as he started to see that championship lead slip away. So tough break for Oscar. Tough break for McLaren too, which we'll get to in a second as far as how this weekend played out. But just one that's really going to stick with Oscar for a very long time. But going to the race winners, because again, Mercedes really stole the show this weekend. And there was a lot of talk coming out of testing about whether Mercedes was sandbagging or if they just weren't as good as we thought they'd be coming into this season. But after Sunday's race, it's clear they were sandbagging. This car is as fast as we thought it would be, and this car is at the top of the pecking order. They were holding back through some of the early practice sessions, FP1, FP2, but once we got to qualifying, once we got to the end of FP3 where they really started to turn things up and turn that engine up, it was clear They look like the strongest car. But at the same time, I think Mercedes still needs to be a little bit cautious and still have their guard up, because Australia is a good track to get a feel for the strength of these cars, but it's not indicative as to how the rest of the season's going to go. China is a really good example for that. The track we get next weekend. Much longer straights, much slower corners, much different when it comes to managing these batteries and getting the most out of these cars lap after lap. But on top of that too, development is going to be at an all-time high this year, with this being the first year of a new regulation cycle. It's something that we always see when the regulations change, where we start at a good baseline, but then the development really ramps up as these teams get on track, as they start to figure things out, and as they get answers as to what works and what doesn't work. What are other teams doing? What's working for them? What's not working for them? We start getting a little bit of, it's a copycat league. These teams always, of course, they have to come up with it on their own and show that their own work and show that they did their homework, but they're looking at other cars and they're stealing what they can off of the other cars to basically close the gap and make things a lot more competitive. So that's something that Mercedes is definitely going to have to watch out for. But at the same time, Mercedes has a really good track record when it comes to in-season development. Of course, they have had their moments, the zero side pod error of 2022, where they get it completely wrong. And sometimes they can be a little too stubborn and think that they'll figure things out when there's really no hope. So hopefully they've learned from that and something for them to watch out for. But again, development is going to be very key. But the good news for Mercedes is they're starting on the best foot possible and starting ahead of everyone else. Really strong weekend from George, though. And I think he definitely lived up to the hype of being the title favorite. And that was good to see, because I think that's the biggest question for George this season is how exactly is he going to handle this pressure of being the title favorite, being out in front, being the one who people expect to come away with the race win weekend after weekend. How is he going to handle that pressure? In his first test, I think he aced it. His qualifying pace on Sunday was just absolutely unreal. 8/10 faster than the closest car that wasn't his teammate. Now, race pace might be a little tighter than expected, and something for Mercedes and something for George to watch out for. Because again, I'm a little disappointed in Ferrari's strategy blunder, because I really would have liked to see George under some more pressure. We did see it during those first 11 laps, and George did handle it pretty well, but I wanted to see that throughout the entire race. I wanted to see him at the end of the race when things are really coming down to it, and he's got a Ferrari breathing down his neck. How does he handle that? Does he make a mistake? Does he dip a wheel off track? Does he lose some time when the pressure is at the highest? Something we're going to have to be a little more patient on, but that's going to be the key for him this season. Will he get it right, or will he crack under pressure when things get tight? But at least for this weekend, did a great job, managed the race really well. Of course, he became the de facto forgotten about leader on the TV coverage. You really didn't see much of him other than the beginning of the race when he was fighting with the Ferraris, a little bit of the middle part when he's working his way back up to the front, and of course the end as he's taking the checkered flag. But this was the start to the season that George needed. Beating out the competition, beating out his teammate, and starting the season at the top of the standings. It was a little bit sloppier for his teammate, but still pretty good result for Kimi and a pretty good weekend. Of course, he did crash in FP3, which put his qualifying in jeopardy. 100% saved by Max's crash in Q1. That brought out the red flag and bought them enough time to get his car fixed and get him on track into Q1. And of course, had some other sketchy moments in qualifying. The team leaving their leaf blowers, I think they're called leaf blowers, if we want to call them. Leaf blowers sounds a little, I don't know, not very Formula One, esque, but the blowers in the side pods being left in for Q3. Kimi goes out on track. They fall out right away. Lando comes across, hits one of them, brings out another red flag. I was surprised there wasn't a penalty for that. Again, something that is 100% on the team. No fault at all on Kimi. You can't expect him to look over and see those blowers in the side pods and say, hey guys, why don't we get these out? Might be a good idea. That is 100% on the team to recognize, and all of the blame goes on them. But this was a situation where it caused damage to another car. Pretty egregious mistake to make, and Lando was lucky that it didn't completely ruin his qualifying. Very easily could have, if he doesn't run that over with his tire and instead runs it over with the body of the car, and it causes damage to the floor, front wing, whatever the case may be. Maybe even gearbox if it goes all the way back there. So Very lucky for Lando and McLaren that they dodged a bullet there, and Mercedes is very lucky that the penalty that they got wasn't more severe, because I honestly was expecting a grid drop for Kimi, and I don't think it would have mattered anyway because he would have made his way up the field. Maybe it makes things a little more interesting for Ferrari, but at the end of the day, I think they shot themselves in the foot with their poor strategy calls in not bringing them into the pits, which we'll get into in a second. But for Kimi, he ends up qualifying P2, ends up finishing the race P2, which is probably where the team expected him to be. But the race wasn't so pretty for him either. He had to do a lot of recovering throughout the race, had an absolutely terrible start, fell all the way down to P7, just crawling off of the line, didn't go into anti-stall, but looked like he was pretty close in just inching off that line, but lost a lot of positions and made it all the way down to P7 after those first few turns. But again, two things. Kimi had the pace to work his way back up the order, and Kimi got a lot of help from Ferrari. Because if Ferrari got their strategy call right, I don't know if we're seeing Kimi on the podium. I think there's a good chance we see a Ferrari double podium if they come in under the VSC. And if it's at least one car coming in, I think Kimi at least loses that P2 spot and that Ferrari catches up to him. But good result for Kimi and a good, something that hopefully he'll be able to build on. But there's still a lot for him to focus on and a lot for him to clean up, because it's going to be a hard season for Kimi if George is looking this strong, because he's going to want to keep up with George. And that's probably where he's going to get into trouble. He needs to just worry about himself right now. He needs to focus on cleaning things up, putting in consistent weekends, putting in consistent practice sessions, consistent qualifyings, and avoiding these ups and downs throughout a race weekend and hoping that it all works out. And this weekend it did work out for him. But there's a good chance that same formula of events, if Max doesn't crash, if there's a penalty because of the airbox issue and that falling onto track with Lando, if the Ferraris get their strategy right, we're probably looking at a much different result for Kimi, and that's when the pressure starts ramping up. Because this Mercedes team is at the top. They expect these results, and they need these results with how close Ferrari looks to be able to win the Drivers' Championship, but more importantly, to be able to win the Constructors' Championship and have Kimi have a say in that. So definitely something for Kimi to work on, and the focus needs to be on himself and just getting the most out of the car in every session. And if he can do that, the results are going to come. But overall, again, very good weekend for Mercedes. They have a clear advantage with speed. And they might also have an advantage with tire saving too. And Ferrari, another area where they might be close and might not be that far off. But for the rest of the field, not even close to being at the same level as Mercedes when it comes to tire saving. I mean, everyone pretty much had to make the two-stop work. But then you've got Mercedes and you've got Ferrari doing the one-stop. And that's something that can go a long way. Because at a track like this, you cut out a pit stop, we're talking 20 seconds, maybe even 25 if it's a green flag pit stop. So something that can go a long way, especially for a team that already has a clear advantage when it comes to speed and comes to race pace. But again, just a really, really good weekend for Mercedes and exactly the start to the season that they were hoping for. Let's go to their next best competitor, though, and that would be Ferrari. P3 for Charles Leclerc, P4 for Lewis Hamilton. Good result overall, but at the same time, a little bit disappointing, because coming out of testing, they look like they might be the best team. And on paper, coming out of today, it looks like they might have had some work to do. But when you really look up to things, or look into things, I don't know. I don't know if we can definitively say that Mercedes has them beat, because in my opinion, Ferrari might have given away a race win today, and at the very least gave away a double podium. So the VSC comes out on lap 11 after Isaac Hadjar has the mechanical problems and retires from the race. And the front runners were at a disadvantage initially because of where they were on track when the VSC came out. But it stayed out longer than expected. And those front runners came around. And they had the chance at a cheap pit stop under the VSC. And everyone seemed to take that opportunity. Except for Ferrari. I didn't understand it in the moment. I still don't understand it now. Because time and time again, we see teams make this same mistake, and it doesn't seem like anyone learns from it. I mean, we just have to go back to Qatar of last year when McLaren did the exact same thing, and it cost them the race win. You have to capitalize on getting a cheap pit stop under the safety car or under the VSC. It's just too risky to bank on another one happening. And even if you do get another one, like we did in this race, you can still miss out. It can be short. You can be on the wrong end of the track. Exactly what we saw happen to Ferrari when that second VSC came out on lap 18 or whatever it was when Valtteri Bottas retired. So on its face, looking at the timing sheets, it looks like it wouldn't have mattered for Ferrari, and it still would have been a P3 and P4 because he gained about 10 seconds pitting under the VSC opposed to pitting under the green flag. And both Ferrari cars finished 15, 16 seconds behind George Russell, 12, 13 seconds behind Kimi. So add the 10 seconds back in. Oh, they're still going to be 3 seconds behind Kimi, 5 seconds behind George. But think about the difference it would have made if Ferrari did pit their drivers and Leclerc came out in front of Russell. And he was the one running in clean air after the restart instead of George Russell. Think about the time Ferrari lost at the end of their first stint when both Mercedes drivers were on tires that were 12 laps newer. All of that together, that probably makes up those 5 to 6 seconds. And it's no guarantee that Leclerc or Lewis would have won, but they without a doubt would have been in the mix. And there's a chance they might have come out on top. But, of course, when the VSC came out, Charles and Lewis were 2 seconds apart. So I do understand the concerns of, okay, can we make the double stack work? Are we going to lose a lot of time for Lewis specifically being in that position, falling back down the order? But if that's the hesitation with the Ferrari pit wall, at least bring one driver in. It just doesn't make any sense not to keep both of those drivers out, put them both at risk of having that disadvantage of not having another good safety car or VSC to get another cheap pit stop, just like we saw happen to McLaren in Qatar of last year. But I just don't understand it. It's the first race of the season. You don't need to worry about driver penalty or driver priorities or introducing Ferrari's version of the papaya rules. You just have to worry about giving yourself the best shot of coming away with the race win. And if you want to bank on another VSC or another safety car coming out, just do that with your second driver. Put that first driver in a better position. Capitalize on that moment as it presents itself. And just don't gamble and try to play the prediction market and try to hope that things work out the best for you. You have to take the opportunity when the opportunity presents itself. But for Ferrari, if they really want to be competitive this year, they have to avoid making these mistakes because it looks like they have the car to really compete this year. They have the edge with race starts that we saw in testing. They look like they have a tire saving advantage, just like we saw with Mercedes. And once things get going, they look fast enough to keep up with the Mercedes. Again, that battle that we saw between Leclerc, George, and eventually Lewis during those first 10 laps. Absolutely incredible. Something that we haven't seen in this sport in a very, very long time. Both cars were right there in the mix and at times looked like the stronger car over the Mercedes. But Ferrari just threw it all away with poor strategy. And that's unfortunately been the story for Ferrari for far too long, season after season. They look like they have it, and then strategy comes into play and the pit wall just screws it all up. But something about this season just looks and feels different for Ferrari. They look like they might finally have the tools to compete at the top. But if they want to finally end this championship drought, 19 years since their last Drivers' Championship, 18 years since their last Constructors' Championship, fixing these strategy mishaps has to be a top priority because Ferrari cannot afford to shoot themselves in the foot like we saw today. Going to the next midfield team, or not midfield team, excuse me, the next top team, but a little down the order. Let's talk about McLaren. P5 for Lando Norris. Probably where the team expected them to be, ultimately. But a disappointing weekend for Lando because he struggled a lot this weekend. Of course, he missed a lot of practice time because of gearbox and power unit issues in FP1 and FP2. But once he got his weekend going, he just had a really hard time managing the new modes on this car. And it seemed a little distracting for him too, which was a little concerning to watch. And he admitted that's why he hit Antonelli's blower that fell out on track during qualifying. He was too busy looking at his steering wheel, looking at the speed, trying to figure out when he's going to need to brake based on how fast he was going and where the battery was. So definitely something for him to work on and something for us to watch out for because that's probably the biggest change for these drivers is not only are they unable to push flat out because of just the battery and just the speed, but they're also unable because they're too occupied looking at the steering wheel and trying so hard to manage the battery and just manage all of these modes. So seems like it's more of a problem for Lando. than a lot of other drivers, and hopefully for him, something that he can get a handle on. But it was also a little bit concerning too, because both of the McLaren drivers started out a little rough, but then Oscar started to pull away. He again had the fastest time in FP2, but in all the other sessions, he just had this edge over Lando. He had the grasp on the car that Lando didn't have. He was finding pace that Lando could not find. So a little bit concerning, especially for Lando coming off of this championship, thinking, all right, he's probably going to be a lot more relaxed and just not feel that pressure. But here he is feeling a little bit of pressure from his teammate. And of course, with Oscar, coming off of last season, I'm sure Oscar was a lot more motivated during the offseason than Lando was. And I'm sure Oscar probably spent a little more time working on his craft than Lando did. So maybe that explains it. But definitely something for Lando to work on as the season progresses. And at least it's understandable that McLaren might not be at the top and they might have a long way to go with development. But Lando at least wants to see himself close to Oscar. And maybe Oscar's a little bit ahead, but at least within reach where the performance isn't that different. Because that was the biggest concern for him last year. Oscar making these gains in his career, being in his third season, already closing the gap to Lando that fast and that quickly, and at times looking much better than Lando. And for a lot of us, we were sitting there thinking, what's this going to look like in the future? Is Oscar going to continue to progress, continue to gain an edge over Lando? And over time, Lando's just going to be put further and further and further behind Oscar. So, again, something for Lando to watch out for and something that he really needs to get a handle on. But at the end of the day, very understandable considering all of the issues that he had to deal with in the free practice sessions and just how important all of that was for getting things right this weekend and learning how to drive these cars. But for McLaren, they've got a lot of work to do if they want to catch up to Mercedes and Ferrari. But there is good news. They have the people in the building to turn things around with upgrades. We've seen it since 2023. This is a team that has a really good track record of getting the upgrades right and things translating on track from their wind tunnel. And they should get a better handle on the Mercedes power unit because this was the first weekend that they were running with the true Mercedes power unit. Of course, in testing, Mercedes isn't required to give McLaren, Williams, Alpine, all of their customers the same engine that they're using. When the Grand Prix start, that's when it has to be the same. So this is McLaren's first weekend of having this true Mercedes power unit. And they admitted after the race too, they were doing a lot of reacting instead of being proactive like they've been used to because of all of that. So long way for McLaren to go, but there are some bright spots. But at the same time, to play devil's advocate might take a little longer than they'd hoped. Because back in 2023, in 2024, they had a lot more wind tunnel time than the other teams had. But now this year, at least for this first half of the year, coming off of the championship season, they're going to have the least amount of wind tunnel time. So they're going to have the least amount of opportunities to get things right and develop their car, at least until the halfway point of the season when all of those wind tunnel times reset based on the midseason standings. Another concern for them too, it seems like they've lost their tire saving advantage. Huge advantage for them in the last 2 years and a huge key to their success in something that seems like it's completely evaporated this year. Again, we had Mercedes, we had Ferrari, a few other teams, Racing Bulls, Red Bull, making the one-stop work. Lando couldn't do it. Had to stop twice. It would have been interesting to see exactly what it would have looked like for Oscar if there was, that same difference or if there was an improvement on Oscar's end, which is another thing to watch out for, especially if McLaren is dealing with this tire saving issue. And it's a lot different because that has been Oscar's biggest struggle. Tire management, race pace, burning through the tires too quickly. And it's something that we were deprived of this race because of what happened to him pre-race and not being able to run the race at all. So something to be keep a very close eye on as this season continues with Oscar specifically. How bad is this problem going to be for him? But we know it's at least bad for Lando and probably not a good sign because tire management and race pace has definitely been Lando's strong suit for his entire career. So for McLaren, a lot to figure out. 2026 is not going to be 2025 or 2024 for this team, but they finished probably where they expected to, and they have work to do, but they at least don't look completely lost. Going to the other top team, let's talk about Red Bull. Just an absolutely incredible recovery drive from Max Verstappen. Not surprising. We've seen it time and time again. Of course, he had that crash in qualifying. Kind of a concerning crash. Very, very interesting crash. One that I don't put any blame on Max himself, and one that we've seen happen time and time again throughout preseason testing. Most notably happened to Lance Stroll in Bahrain, but it seems to be a problem with these new generation of cars where they're going into a corner, they hit the brakes, and all of a sudden the engine just locks up the rear axle, shoots energy into the rear axle, into the rear brakes, completely throws the rear end of the car out, causes them to spin out, and there's just no saving it. And I was surprised that we didn't see more of that throughout this race. We didn't see more of that this weekend, because if this is happening to a driver like Max Verstappen, one of the best drivers on the grid, if not the best driver on the grid, it's going to happen to anyone. I mean, it's just inevitable. So definitely something for the FIA and for all of these teams to keep an eye on and really try to get a handle on, because I think until this issue is addressed, we're going to see a lot of this, and we're going to see a lot of unexpected DNFs and a lot of unexpected cars going off track because of this rear axle locking issue. But for Max, dealing with that, of course, the crash put him all the way down in P20 to start the race, but Max Verstappen, an incredible start off the race, but I mean, we just know how he does this time and time again, even when he starts from the pit lane. We saw it in Brazil of last year. He works his way up the field so quickly. And by lap 12 in this race, he was already in P6. So just incredible performance by Max and just doing what Max always does. And we knew he was going to work his way up the order, but I don't think any of us expected it to happen that quickly. But good news for Red Bull. Car's fast. Probably at the same level or close to McLaren. So they still have a ways to go as far as catching up to Mercedes and Ferrari. But they've got Max Verstappen. And Max is going to get a handle on these new engine and battery modes faster than anyone. And with everything being considered for this Red Bull team, knowing they're probably going to start the season a little, step behind Mercedes and Ferrari, knowing that they're coming into this season with a new power unit, the power unit program that they're basically heading on their own, no longer a customer team. They still have a way to go, but a really good start for Red Bull. And we know they're better than anyone when it comes to in-season development. We saw it last year. We've seen it year after year after year. So I wouldn't be surprised if this season is a repeat of what we saw last year, where they're starting here and they're starting a little bit down the order, and they certainly have their issues to figure out. But once we get to the summer break, once we get to the mid-season point, wouldn't surprise me at all if Red Bull is at the top, if not the sole car at the top, winning races and being competitive. It was a promising weekend for Isaac Hadjar. First weekend as a Red Bull driving, of course, had a pretty disappointing Sunday, which we'll get to in a second, but qualifies P3. Very impressive. First time Max was out-qualified by a teammate on pure pace since Baku of 2024. Isaac looked really comfortable in the car all weekend long, which is why I think he's going to be better suited for this second Red Bull seat more than anyone that we've seen since Daniel Ricciardo left in 2019. But again, everything came crashing down for Isaac on Sunday. Great start to the race. Almost had a run at the lead into turn one. And as things started to get going, it looked like, all right, he probably out-qualified the car a little bit, because it wasn't long before he fell down a few spots to Lewis and Kimi, which was, honestly bound to happen. We knew he likely wasn't going to get a podium out of this race. But then on lap 11, all falls apart. Some sort of engine failure. He has to pull off track. Car is smoking like crazy, which is something we haven't seen in a while. But again, probably something that has to be expected with Red Bull this year. I would not be surprised at all if it happens again or even happens to Max, because this is a totally new project for Red Bull and their partnership with Ford, venturing into this for the first time. And also, too, just all of the regulation changes. This isn't something where they can just look at other teams and say, all right, let's just copy their engine and do what they're doing and it'll all work out. Everyone is starting from scratch and everyone is starting new. And it's just going to be more of a struggle for Red Bull and for Ford. And I think, if anything, that's probably going to be what holds them back the most, because they've got Max Verstappen and now they've got a pretty good second Red Bull driver. So they should have the drivers in place to put in the performances. It's just a question as to where the car is going to be. But overall, I think this has to be a weekend that Red Bull's happy about. All right, let's talk some midfield teams. What a debut for Arvid Lindblad. Qualified P9, ends up finishing the race in P8, the third youngest point scorer in F1 history. Just an incredible performance. And it all started with the start of the race. He got a great start off the line, gained 5 spots after the first few turns, made it all the way up to P3 at one point. I mean, he was up there driving with the top drivers and looked very confident doing it. I was really impressed with how he looked this weekend, but also, too, just how comfortable he already looks, how fearless he already is. I mean, at one point, he was racing against Max, defending pretty well. Of course, a few moments where I was sitting there thinking, all right, you're kind of toeing the line with weaving or moving under braking, so probably something he needs to be a little careful of and try to, tweak there as far as his approach. But to have that mentality right away, to go against a 4-time world champion, to go against the top driver at the senior team that you're racing for, and defend like that, very impressive and very promising. And honestly, I think this was first race of his F1 career. Might already been his coming out party, because a lot of us are coming away very impressed with his driving abilities and saying he might be something special. Because again, we've seen it with so many drivers. Usually you can see these things, or at least shades of these things, right away. Usually if they're not good and they're not going to cut it, you can see that right away too. So for Arvid, race 1, to have this type of performance really says a lot and should give him a very strong foundation moving forward in the rest of his career. And I mean, he was highly touted coming into the season, but I would never think that he would look like this in his first race of his career. And realistically, I don't know if this result could have gotten any better for him. I mean, looking at the car that he was driving, looking at the competition, looking at where everyone kind of shook out to be, he maximized everything on this race on Sunday, and he is already cementing himself as someone to keep an eye on as the season progresses. I don't know if we're going to see any podiums from him this year. Might need some chaos for that to happen, kind of similar to what we saw happen with Adjar last year and Lando DNFing in Zandvoort that gave him the podium. But he could be close, and he could be in position to capitalize on that moment if some chaos does happen. But if this is his form, I would at least expect him to finish in the points more often than not. And Racing Bulls have to feel really good that they have a driver of this caliber on their team this season, and someone to replace Isaac, who's really carrying a lot of the load for them this season. But as good as it was for Arvid, it made it even a harder day for Liam Lawson, an even more difficult result, because he qualifies P8 but only ends up finishing P13. Awful, awful start. Nearly stalled off the line, just inching. I mean, I said Kimi was inching off the line. Look at Liam Lawson's start. It could not have been any slower, and a really, really scary moment with Franco Colapinto almost crashing into the back of him. But because of that, Liam drops all the way down to P20, which was the last car on track with both Oscar Piastri and Nico Hülkenberg being out at that point. But Liam was really on his back foot since then. And strategy was about the same as everyone else. He made up a few positions, but he just didn't have the pace to get through those P11, P15 teams, which is really disappointing because his teammate had the pace to stay in the top 10 and didn't fall back down the order and fall victim to all of those other cars that probably should have been ahead of him. Now, we all know it wouldn't be a race without a Liam Lawson incident, and we had some flashbacks to 2024 Mexico City with Sergio Perez on Sunday. I'm usually pretty hard on Liam and pretty critical of his driving abilities and his driving style, but this one, I'm not putting any blame on him. I don't think this was his fault at all. I think this was all on Sergio. Multiple moments where Sergio forced him off track and, in my opinion, clearly looked like he was on the wrong. Somehow avoided a penalty for all of these moments, but it was a little concerning for Liam that he said after the race that he was frustrated by all of that. Expected it with Sergio, of course, shooting a little shot at him and a jab at him, but also admitted that it didn't matter because his race was already ruined, and of course alluding to the start of the race and falling back down the order. And all of this happened with Sergio on lap 16. There are still 40 plus laps to go. You have to keep fighting, Liam. You can't throw in the towel that early if you have a bad start. I mean, look at all the times we've seen, and I'm not saying you're Max Verstappen, but look at all the times we've seen Max start from the pit lane and all of a sudden he ends the race on the podium. You have to just, especially with all of those laps left in the race, you can't throw in the towel and give up. You're only 4 positions away from the points when all of this is happening. So, little disappointed in Liam's mentality, and something I think is, probably going to be a little bit of a concern, especially if he's already this low on himself to start the season, and he's got a rookie teammate that's doing this well and is a lot more confident than he is. But overall performance, definitely a concern for Liam because, again, he just didn't have the pace to make it up the field. And I think that's something that the team really would have liked to see more of as far as him making more overtakes. And it was an excuse last year, not being able to make those overtakes. The cars are too big. You can't follow in dirty air. That doesn't look like that's a concern anymore. So even if you fall down the order, you should have a car, if you're Liam Lawson, to make up a few spots and make it at least close to your teammate. But just something that he couldn't do. And again, more concerning to me, the mental side of things when it comes to Liam. What I just mentioned, getting beaten this badly by your rookie teammate in the first race. Because this was supposed to be a more comfortable year for Liam with that rookie teammate. One where he could relax a little bit, go into a mentorship role, not have that pressure of, all right, I got to put in these performances if I want to keep my seat. Having just a little bit more security. But now it looks like this could be a repeat of last year, with Liam being outperformed by that rookie teammate. Having that pressure put back on him. Maybe the team eventually asking the question, do we need to move on? Should we be looking elsewhere? So definitely something for Liam to look out for and to watch out for, and something for him to work on. But at the end of the day, it's race 1 out of 24, maybe 22, depending on how Saudi Arabia and Bahrain go. But there's still a lot of time for him to figure this out. So he really needs to work. And it's a quick turnaround before we get to China. But he needs to hit the reset button, come into the Chinese Grand Prix ready to capitalize on his opportunities, put in a good result, and at least be close to his teammate. But for the team, overall, pretty good weekend for Racing Bulls. They're in the mix for the best of the rest conversation. And their biggest unknown in Arvid Lindblad seems like it could be one of their biggest positives. Not exactly the Sunday Audi was hoping for, but they look like they're also in the mix for being the top midfield team. P9 for Gabriel Bortoleto. Of course, his teammate Nico Hulkenberg never started the race. Had a technical issue while he was on the grid for the start procedure that the team was unable to fix. So disappointing because Nico qualified P11. It looked like he was in a really good position to capitalize on that and maybe come away with some points, but disappointing there, and one that I'll have to just forget about, move on, and try to fix moving into the Chinese Grand Prix. But for his teammate, really good race for Gabriel Bortoleto. A little bit of a disappointment on Saturday not being able to run in Q3 because his car broke down coming into the pits, and he looked really strong in qualifying and really strong in the practice session. So just makes it even more disappointing because you thought, can he make it up there? Can he mix it in with those top teams? Maybe out-qualify a Red Bull, out-qualify a McLaren. So little disappointing, but at the same time, just making it to Q3, starting P10, is a feat he and the team should be very proud of, especially being this team transitioning from Sauber to Audi, going through all those changes. Of course, it is still the same team, but still a big change, different manufacturer, starting their own power unit and, going about things their own way on that front. So very, very good result for Audi. And Gabriel finishing P9 on Sunday, pretty good for him to maintain that position. Of course, he gained a spot from the Hadjar retirement, but not falling victim to those other cars behind him, showing that they had the race pace, because we saw it in the practice sessions, we saw it in qualifying, we knew they had the one-lap pace, but race pace is a totally different ball game. So for them to have this strong of a performance, very, very good. And coming into this weekend, there were a lot of question marks and doubts about Audi in their performance. What exactly would they look like coming into this season? And I think they answered all of those questions. And it was really impressive to see this team come back and start the season this strong after all of those changes that they made in the offseason. The last team that's probably in the mix for best of the rest, I've got Haas. I think they've got to say in that conversation. P7 for Ollie Beerman after qualifying 12th. P11 for Esteban Ocon after qualifying 13th. Pretty rough start to the race for Ollie. Wasn't the best start off the line, but also really slowed down by Liam Lawson nearly being stopped on track and having to avoid a collision with him. But to Ollie's benefit, he has a car that has a lot of pace. And behind probably only Max, Ollie did the best job at working his way up the field on pure pace alone. Preview of what we're going to see all season, though. Ollie's a special talent. And I think more weekends than not, he's going to outperform this car and he's going to find himself in the points and might even find himself a lot closer to the top teams than we expect. So it might seem like a surprise now, but I think this is going to become a routine for Ollie, where we're seeing him finish P6, P7, P8, not on the fringes of the points, but getting some solid points and maybe even stealing them away from some of the top teams. It was a decent Sunday for his teammate Esteban Ocon, but not exactly what he was hoping for. Just missed out on points in P11. Really good start to the race for him, though. Gained 5 positions and made it all the way up to P8. But then, looking at how the race played out, I think he got bitten by poor strategy decisions. He came in for hard tires on lap 11 under the VSC, dropped him down to 10th, but then they decided to go for the one stop. And he just never seemed like he was able to make up any ground on that front. Then towards the end of the race, the cars behind him, they're just on better tires because of different strategies and were able to close the gap and get around him and drop him down the order a little bit. So I don't really fault Esteban too much for this one. I think a lot of this goes on the pit wall and not really mistakes that he has made. So definitely something for Haas to work on and just perfect. And sometimes these things too with strategy. When you're one of these midfield teams, you've never really been in this situation before where you have to make these decisions and they're determinative on, whether or not you're going to finish with points. Haas has had some of that experience, but they haven't had the experience like a McLaren, a Red Bull, a Mercedes, a Ferrari. So still a lot of room for them to learn and definitely something for them to work on. But the results should get better for Esteban once they start to get that right. And this could be a team that is consistently getting double points finishes, and that could go a long way for this midfield race. But the good news for them is their car looks fast, and they probably do have a benefit using that Ferrari power unit, and that's probably something that's carrying them a long way. But really good start to the season and a really strong foundation. But again, the biggest question mark is probably going to come with Esteban. Can he close the gap, and can he stay in contention with his teammate Ollie Beerman? But also, too, I'm expecting Ollie to be the top driver. I'm rarely expecting Esteban to finish ahead of Ollie. And how is Esteban going to handle being the second driver? Is he going to accept the role? Is he going to make things smooth? Or is he going to kind of put up a fight? And is that going to get into his head? Is it going to hurt his performances and drop him down the order? So definitely something to keep an eye on as far as just his mentality with this, because he's been in this sport for a very long time. I think he came in 2014 or 15 maybe. So he's been in for over a decade. He's definitely he's probably out of his prime now and on the other side of the hill. So something that he's probably going to have to accept if he wants to stay in the sport and just know that this is probably the role that's going to be his for a while now and probably going to be the role that he has for the rest of his career. But not an easy thing to accept for a driver, really anyone who's been in the sport as long as he has. But definitely the key for Haas this year, because the car looks like it's there. It's just a matter of if the drivers will be there too. Disappointing weekend for Williams. Writing has been on the wall since testing that they weren't where they wanted to be, but now we have the confirmation of a race weekend, and it looks bad. P12 for Alex Albon after qualifying 15th. P15 for Carlos Sainz after qualifying 21st. Just a long list of reliability problems that started in practice that really hurt them the rest of the weekend. Kind of like we saw with Lando, where they just weren't able to get those practice times in and just capitalize on learning this car and figuring out how to manage these modes before things really came down to qualifying and the race. But the worst of it came in qualifying, with Carlos Sainz not being able to run a single lap, which of course knocked him out in Q1 and made him start all the way down in 21st. But even for Alex Albon, who was able to put in the qualifying laps, pace just wasn't there. And that continued on Sunday. Sainz, of course, finishing 15th, but only 16 cars finished the race. The only one who finished behind him was the remaining Cadillac, which you expect to be the last car after the Aston Martins both retire. But Albon never really seemed like a threat to make up any ground either. Just not a good performance from either of them. And the other concern, outside of the lack of pure pace, is the car burns through tires so much faster than the others. It was a 2-stop for Albon and a 3-stop for Sainz. The only other team who made that many stops was Aston Martin, who has even more problems and probably shouldn't even be considered as an F1 team at this point. But not good for Williams. And it's probably something that will continue to haunt them for these first handful of races, because it's going to take a little bit of time to figure out this whole tire issue, redesign the front wings, the chassis, whatever they need to at least get themselves on the same playing field as the rest of these teams. And again, like tire saving can be a huge disadvantage, it can be, or a huge advantage, it can be a huge disadvantage if you don't have it right. Similar to what we saw, I mean, it was more mechanical problems in 2023 too, but still some tire issues with McLaren in 2023, where that first race, I think it was Bahrain, they came in, Lando had 5 pit stops that race, so not where you want to be. But the good news for Williams is we are in an era, and the testing times and the wind tunnel times are set up where, like McLaren in 2023, those teams are set up to recover, put in the resources, put in the research to get on top of things and really turn things around. So hopefully that's something that can happen with Williams. But right now, not where they want to be, and just not a good start to the season. Now, the other good news for them is they should get a better handle as the season goes on the power unit that Mercedes is providing to them. They, of course, also echoed McLaren's statement that they were on their back foot trying to figure out this new power unit and how Mercedes is performing so well with the same equipment. But they've got a lot to work on and a lot of problems that they need to address, and it's just not the spot that they want to be in. And you have to feel bad for Carlos Sainz being in this position. I mean, he joined Williams last year, and he was sold on this dream that, all right, 2025, going to be difficult. Not going to be our year at all. You're going to have to be patient with us. But 2026, that's where our focus is. That's going to be our year. That's where we're going to get back on top of things and maybe even be competitive at the front. And now the time has come, and they look this bad. And it just has to be a gut punch for Carlos Sainz. And to make matters worse, it's not a lot you can do as a driver in that situation. You can push the team. You can give some input as to, go back to his Ferrari days and say, hey, we, handle things this way. But at the same time, new generation, new cars, new equipment, new everything. And it's really on the team at this point to get on top of this car and equip these drivers with better machinery. It was a decent day for Pierre Gasly, but not a great result for his teammate Franco Colapinto based on expectations. P10 for Gasly after qualifying P14, P14 for Franco Colapinto after qualifying 16th. It's probably a result that Alpine should be happy with, especially Pierre's result coming away with at least 1 point, which was something that was very rare for them last year. But there are a lot of strong midfield teams this year too, so it is going to be hard to get some points. But at the same time, a little bit of a disappointment because they looked a lot stronger during testing, and the expectations were probably set a little too high as a result of all that. But for Pierre's race, again, came away with a point, so at least some positives coming away there. But really, really good start from Pierre, gaining 5 positions on lap 1, making it all the way up to P9. And then after that, kind of just settled in, ran his own race, which does tell you something about this Alpine car because Pierre had the pace to maintain that position, come away with a good result. For his teammate, though, much different Sunday for him. Of course, really scary moment with Franco at the start of the race, almost running into the back of Liam Lawson. Really impressed that he had the reflexes to avoid that collision at the last minute without running into Lawson or the wall. But unfortunately, it's probably going to see a lot of that this year from time to time with race starts in this new procedure with these new power units, because it just seems so tricky and it seems so easy to stall out these new cars. And if you don't stall out, just kind of inch off the line and be really slow, like we saw with Kimi Antonelli, like we saw with Liam Lawson. So really scary stuff for this race, but unfortunately something that I think the drivers are going to have to be alerted to and kind of have the radar up on race starts. But on top of that, too, to make matters worse for Franco, he also got a 10-second stop-and-go penalty for the team personnel touching the car on the grid after the 15-second signal. They got the penalty because they should have started from the pit lane after touching the car, so something they could have avoided and probably something that wouldn't really have made too much of a difference for them. But because of all that, Franco had to come in on lap 9 to serve that penalty, which obviously hampered his race. Definitely some things out of his control that hurt him. But this was not the Sunday that Franco needed. And he did have some understandable excuses, but at the same time, he works for a boss that doesn't really accept excuses. And we all know it. Franco knows it too. He's going to need to put in better results if he wants to stay in good standing with Flavio Briatore, and if he wants to stay on this team long term. that patience is going to run thin if he's finishing P14, and the team expects him to finish in the points. So again, some blame on him. It definitely could have been a lot, or excuse me, some blame on the pit wall. Definitely could have been a lot worse, but there's a little bit of blame on Franco for not having that pace throughout the race and not being able to make it up at least some positions and make it close to the points. So definitely something for him to watch out for, but at the end of the day, maybe not the weekend that Alpine was hoping for, but at least they were able to get something out of it. Tough debut for Cadillac, but kind of expected when you've got a team coming into the sport like this. P16 for Sergio Perez after qualifying 18th. DNF for Valtteri Bottas due to a technical issue very early into the race. Just growing pains for Cadillac, and it's probably going to be a season full of them. Again, it's just what you have to expect when you have a new team coming into the sport, starting fresh and just not having... They're not taking over a team like Audi is taking over from Sauber. They have to start fresh with their resources. They have to start fresh with everything, their infrastructure, their wind tunnel, all of it. So very, very disadvantageous spot to be in. But the goal for them right now is halfway accomplished from this race. They just need to worry about finishing races, getting a full race in, getting the data to be able to look back on and say, all right, what tweaks do we need to make? What kind of upgrades do we need to make? What changes do we need to make to really get on top of things? And again, it's something that takes time, years realistically, before teams are able to be competitive starting from this point. So a lot of patience is going to be need to be shown from Cadillac. But again, disappointing for Valtteri not being able to finish the race, having the power issues. Of course, he had an excellent start, gained 4 places, but it didn't take long for those reliability issues to come into play. He actually came into the pits on lap 12 just to change his steering wheel. No tire changes, and then the retirement came a few laps later after that. And it was bad enough where they told Valtteri to immediately stop the car to avoid further damage. So something serious must have been going on there. But again, something that you expect with these new teams. There are probably going to be a lot of mechanical failures for Cadillac this year, and it's probably not going to be the prettiest result. But again, if they can finish these races like Sergio did, that's all that they need to worry about. And again, with Sergio, not the prettiest race from him. We did see some rust from him, especially those moments with Liam Lawson, just something that I thought was completely his fault and pretty poor driving from an experienced driver like him. But we'll chalk it up to rust and hopefully something that he can, kind of work on and get out of his system as these races continue on. So not the best weekend for Cadillac, but again, they had one car that finished the race. And I think that's at least one win that they can take away from Melbourne. For the last team, bottom of the order, probably going to be at the bottom of the order for some time, Aston Martin. Double retirement for both drivers as expected. Only 21 laps for Fernando Alonso and only 43 for Lance Stroll. Better than expected, considering what we were hearing heading into this weekend, but still extremely disappointing that they're in this position. If there's any positive to take away, I guess it's with Fernando's start, gaining 7 places and making it all the way up to P10 before those reliability problems really started coming into play. So at least they have that figured out. But man, do they have so many problems that they have to figure out. But the biggest thing is with this engine vibration issue. It's just stopping them from putting together any sort of competitive car and just causing so many problems with the car. And seems like such a mountain for them to climb where either they're going to have to redesign the other car or they're going to have to spend a lot of resources trying to build protections around the engine, around the battery, around all of these other problems. And there's no guarantee that what they do is going to fix the problem. So hopefully they can get on top of things and they just don't spiral as this season goes on. But really, really tough weekend for Aston Martin and just a lot of problems going on. And also, too, not some great reports that are coming out from Honda right now with Aston Martin. We got a lot of surprising headlines during the preseason about this Aston Martin situation, but probably the most surprising came this weekend with the news about how out of the loop Aston Martin was about Honda's project and Honda maybe hiding the ball from Aston Martin. So basically the timeline, they signed this deal 3 years ago in 2022, 2023. Honda was giving Aston Martin updates as to how things were going on, but apparently Aston Martin never visited the facility until last November when they started getting concerned and they were looking at the numbers that Honda was giving them and looking at their own numbers and saying something's off here. Something's not adding up. So they finally go to the Honda facility in November. They learn how bad it really is. They learn how bad the whole Honda project really is, where they, and if you remember too, Honda, of course, was, supplying Red Bull engines, decided to drop out of the sport, reverse course after about a year or so. So their engine program, their F1 programs completely ceased for about a year or so. And because of all that, all of the employees were reassigned to different departments within Honda. Adrian Newey said some of them were working on solar panels. And then they brought it all back together. But with all of this, I've got blame on both sides. I mean, Honda was clearly hiding the ball, and I think this is without a doubt going to result in a lawsuit against Honda. Maybe even Aston Martin trying to cancel the contract and move on to another supplier, which is a question in itself of which is the more efficient option. Do you forgive Honda and work with them to figure this out? Or do you jump ship and have to start fresh with a new engine supplier, which could cost a lot more time and more money? But also there has to be blame on Aston Martin. How do you sign this contract 3 years ago and you only visit the facility in November of 2025? Right as you're going into the offseason, right before this huge regulation change is about to happen. Almost malpractice on Aston Martin's, side of things. So definitely blame goes to both sides and finger pointing to both sides, but just an awful, awful situation that Aston Martin has found themselves in, and just not a surprising result with all of this going on. And unfortunately, it's probably something that's going to continue, at least through China, at least through Japan, probably a little bit after that too. So before I finish up, I wanted to do a quick little, segment on these new regulations and my initial thoughts on them, and kind of, are we overreacting? Are we underreacting? Should we be worried about this? Should we be a little more patient with this? I decided to hold off on it. I have some thoughts, what I saw today, especially those first 10 laps, we haven't seen that type of racing in a very long time. And maybe that is a good thing for the sport. But at the same time, I do understand the concerns. I mean, qualifying, those laps were hideous. Watching them back off that much before turn 9, and just the management. And again, it's not a test of pushing the car flat out who can go the fastest. It's a test of who can get on top of these batteries and manage these cars in the best way. And that's not really F1 and not really what we want to see for the sport. But again, I'm going to hold off on giving my thoughts because I want to see more of a sample size. I don't want to overreact after one race and come to all these conclusions after one race. I want to see some different tracks. I want to see China, which is a completely different track layout. I want to see Japan, another completely different track layout, before I start drawing some conclusions and giving my thoughts on whether these regulations were a good thing, whether they were a bad thing, what needs to be fixed, what needs some more patience, and kind of where everything stands there. So watch out for that. Again, I've got some thoughts, but I'm going to hold off a little more before I share them with you guys. All right, that's a wrap on today's episode recapping the Australian Grand Prix weekend. It was definitely an interesting one, but at least we got some excitement and at least we got some answers to all of the questions that were circulating during the offseason. We, of course, have the Chinese Grand Prix next weekend, and it is a sprint weekend, which will definitely complicate things for these teams as they continue to figure out these new regulations. But I will be back with a preview episode later this week, followed by another recap episode after the Grand Prix on Sunday, so watch out for that. But for now, thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Till next time.